You are tuned in to the Week in Review, presented by the Prosper Group, where the right turns to win online.
Join us each week as we take a look at what is happening in digital advocacy and politics with a right of center focus.
All right. Well, it's been another great week. Welcome back to the Prosper Group Week in Review podcast. Each week, we cover politics and digital from right of center for campaign professionals, political insiders, elected officials, and candidates for office. From the Prosper Group, I'm your host, Dan Huber. On today's show, we'll discuss digital preparation for field and volunteers, weekly social tracking powered by social listening from the Prosper Group, and podcasting for politics. Let's get started right away with our weekly digital tip. Last week, we discussed establishing digital reporting. This week, we're going to jump into planning your digital volunteer infrastructure. So we're only 1.5 weeks out from the Virginia governor's race. The first primaries of 2022 are just over 18 weeks away. That's right, just over 18 weeks away to the first primaries of 2022. It's less than 4 months. I'm sorry, it's less than 5 months, just over 4 months. But now's the time to really start laying the groundwork for your 2022 campaigns. The more complex the campaign, the more sophisticated your operation should be for planning your volunteers. And really, there's a few minimum requirements that you're going to want to have to really laying out a digital infrastructure for planning and being prepared for your volunteer organization, your field organization. You want to centralize the volunteer information as much as possible. So you're going to have a volunteer house file. You should start that now if you don't already have one. Make sure that you're organizing that all in one place. You want to have name, contact info, any notes that are necessary. And remember, your house file for your volunteers, just like your house file for donors, contacts, it's a huge campaign asset. So you want to make sure that you're keeping and saving that. I know that some campaigns traditionally have had challenges and really keeping great records with that. And I think we've improved a lot recently, but really make that a priority. And I think planning ahead and having good habits is a good way to make that happen. So the other requirement that you really want to be building into your planning is to have work and shift planning and signups for your volunteer sheet. So do you need to have a place to track if you need 10 door knockers on Saturday? Do you need someone to deliver collateral? How do you kind of organize and slot that? So be thinking about those things, be prepared, and really put something together. There's a few tools you can use. There's a very simple DIY approach, do it yourself. And this is probably what I think a lot of campaigns, short of statewides and really complex campaigns, are looking at, which is probably just like a Google sheet or an Excel sheet, ideally something that's stored in the cloud so different people can access it and access the volunteers. So make a spreadsheet that stores all the information that we discussed. So name, contact info, any notes associated. This person's great for distributing collateral, maybe signs. This person is a homeschool volunteer. They're really good at making phone calls, knocking doors, and can also bring along so many other people. So have a place for that. And one other thing you can do is if you need a volunteer sign up that is digitally available, if you're going with the Google Sheets route, you can also set up a Google Forms that you can link to in either emails or on your website that you could use for signing up volunteers in general, or even using it as a slot planning. So if you have 10 door knockers that you need and 20 phone bankers, then you could use a Google form to help fill out some of that stuff too. So something to think about there. There's some more sophisticated ways you could approach it. And part of this is just how you store your information. From the information storing standpoint, you could probably use your email platform or whatever system you're using to track your house file in general. So this could just be a subset of your house file that somehow you're marking, tagging that these people are volunteers. That's something to think about. You can use a campaign specific tool. One other thing that you can use, which this probably depends on how technical your volunteers or the people that are really involved with your campaign are. There's some CRMs that are out there that you could use as a free tool, at least as a trial, which probably has enough to maintain your volunteer list. CRMs are systems that are used primarily by businesses for tracking sales calls, tracking customer service calls, other sorts of tracking, but usually they keep track of your house file of who your contacts are. So in this case, your volunteers, and provide some sort of email tool to track what email you've been doing. So that's something that's interesting looking at, but I would definitely say it's important to make sure that you don't make it too complicated. So have a system and a process that works for your field staff. If you have a primarily volunteer-driven organization, so if you're running for state legislature and the person who's managing your field staff is a volunteer and probably not a full-time volunteer as opposed to paid staff, don't make it too complex. Don't make the barrier to entry too difficult. So maybe you just stick with a DIY solution that's very driven by a Google Sheet or Microsoft Excel, and think about it that way. And then once you have something set up, make sure you start testing your solution by getting your volunteers involved. You can get them involved by going to events and, even signing up more volunteers, doing letters to the editor, sharing content. And part of the value of this is just testing, like, is this content where we need it? Is it being updated? Is it actionable, what we're looking for? And speaking of what you're looking for, your keys are provide organization, document the process for your team. Field teams can change quite frequently, whether that's you have different volunteers that are coming in and helping. And oftentimes a volunteer may only be there once or twice. And sometimes on campaigns, if you have someone who's volunteering or leading up your field infrastructure, that person may move up or something may change. So just make sure that you have the process well documented and the information easy to get. And then ensure ease of use for the team. So again, just make sure it's something that people know how to use. Oh, and also designate a person that's close to the campaign, the candidate, to be the owner of the information. So when election day is over, depending on what happens, making sure that somebody knows where that is and they have the access to the information and any documentation or training that needs to be there, so that you can retain that contact info for the future. And also, as new volunteers come in, make sure that they're being added and tracked within your house file so that when everything's said and done, you have an up-to-date house file with lots of information. Ideally, maybe even some notation of who the most reliable volunteers are, not just for recognition purposes, but also so that when you have other things that you need in upcoming elections or post-election day, you know who the people you can count on and reach out to are. So again, I would just say, start planning your digital volunteer infrastructure early, set your team up for success, be prepared for organic growth, and focus on winning. So this information is great for candidates and campaigns that are starting out right now or getting ready to go. And the same information applies. One of the great things about a podcast is that, if you need to come back and get this information 3 months from now, it's going to be here and available. So hope you find this very useful and take it into consideration as you go about doing that. Well, we're going to turn the page and go into our weekly social listening update. Every weekday, the Prosper Group sends out the AM Rundown, which is powered by social listening from PG. To receive the AM Rundown, you can go to our website, prospergroupcorp.com/AM Rundown, and sign up to get the daily updates there. They include a social summary, social trends and politics, and a digital best practice every day. All right, so let's jump into the conversations that we're tracking. There's some sticky topics that we've been following for a while now, the first being the filibuster. Pretty significant growth on filibuster this week. The conversation's up 206% week over week. That's 337,000 tweets, retweets, replies. Definitely a very, a conversation that's out there. And next up is the border crisis. That conversation did tick up 11% this week, week over week. So that's continuing to, stay out there. And one that we've been tracking for a while now, but seems to be getting a little more press, is gas prices. So the conversation around gas prices is up 17%, about 195,000 different posts on Twitter this past week. And that's after gas prices were up another 5.5 cents for the week ending October 18th. So that's up to $3.32.2 per gallon is the nationwide average for gas right now. And that is another high for this year and high dating back to 2014. So continuing to see a lot of conversation and concern about gas prices there. Well, now we're going to go from the sticky topics to our current events that we're following. And these are the featured conversations that we're having right now in the AM Rundown. The first being McAuliffe or Youngkin related to the Virginia governor's race. That conversation's increasing 26% this week. Shouldn't be a big surprise there. We have about a week and a half to go to Election Day in Virginia. So there's a lot of focus in the political world on what's happening, especially with a close race. And what was once thought to be an easy McAuliffe win is now trending towards Youngkin as a very possible kind of surprise upset, and not necessarily a good sign for the Biden administration. So people are paying a lot of attention there. The other conversation that we're tracking right now is redistricting. That conversation's grown 41% this week, week over week. And, again, this is in relation to the 2022 elections approaching. There's a lot of conversations right now as legislatures and different states are looking at their apportionment of seats and how those districts are being laid out. Lots of accusations of gerrymandering going on, and, keeping into consideration that we're really coming up on registration deadlines in states for running for office. As I mentioned earlier, less than 5 months to some of the primary elections that we'll be looking at. So primary elections start in early March, which really isn't that far off, especially when you consider that the holiday season is just around the corner. So there is that. We've also have a couple callback topics that we've followed previously in the AM Rundown that are popping back up in the landscape right now. And so we're going to look at briefly. The infrastructure bill is one of those. That conversation's up 32% this week, up to a total of about 51.9 thousand posts. So sizable, not the biggest thing out there. And part of this relates to a conversation about the Biden administration agenda, the bipartisan infrastructure package that has made progress but has stalled and is awaiting some votes, and then the larger 3.5 trillion or 1.9 trillion, unsure, partisan package that's coming from the administration. And so it fits into that conversation. And also kind of transitions well into our next callback topic, which is Manchin. So Senator Manchin is quite, I guess, infamous is probably the best way to put it on Twitter right now. His conversation's up 518% week over week at 809,000 tweets, retweets, replies, just short, well, just shy of 1 million at 800,000. And that's pretty sizable. That's one of the bigger things we've tracked. There's a lot of digital activists out to eat their own on the left right now, relating to Manchin, and a lot of allegations and rumors out there that are driving that conversation, just with a lot of, I think, the angst in the liberal progressives who are seeing their agenda stalling right now based on several things that are going on in DC and around the country. So kind of an interesting conversation to watch, and probably something we may do a callback on in the next week or two as well. So if you're interested in receiving the AM rundown, as I mentioned, you can go to prospergroupcorp.com/AM rundown and check back each week for tracking and analysis of social conversations around important topics of the day. Well, for our last segment today, we're going to talk about podcasting for politics. Obviously, you probably have some exposure to podcast if you're listening to this right now. Podcasting, for most people, you should think of it as an on-demand alternative to terrestrial radio. The podcast marketplace is growing significantly with an audience base that's younger, educated, and employed. And really kind of gives you that opportunity to get content when you want it, when you're looking for it, with a lot of tailored shows that cover a lot of topic areas. It's a great opportunity for elected officials, advocacy groups, candidates, and campaigns to share messaging and reach out to audiences that they may not be hitting up in other areas. So we're going to look today at kind of what I would say are the three main ways to incorporate podcasting into politics. So one of them is podcasting guest appearances. One is hosting / producing your own podcast. And the third is paid advertisement placements on podcasts. So each of these kind of represents a different level of commitment from the candidate, the campaign, the elected official, or the advocacy organization. We're going to start with paid placement. So this is really probably the most basic podcast exposure piece that's out there. And essentially, this is just like a commercial on terrestrial radio. You record a message, you can have it looped into a download. It can be hyper local, it can be dynamic content. Sometimes these ads may be specific to the broader show, but a lot of these platforms now allow dynamic content. So based on who you are as a consumer of podcasts and some of your factors, whether they be geographic, psychographic, whatever they may be, dynamic content may be put into your download. So kind of an interesting way to expand overall advertising reach. Probably not a bad thing for anyone, but may have limited returns depending on the size and scope of your campaign and how much you can pinpoint who you're trying to reach out to. So that's paid placements. The second one we're going to look at is creating your own podcast. So this is really kind of the bigger, longer term commitment of the three. You can do kind of a limited series of podcasts. Like if you want to go in and say, okay, I have a specific issue and I want to do these 8 things. This is kind of similar if you're familiar with podcasts. Some of the crime podcasts have a story that they want to tell, and maybe they do that in 8 segments. Or think about some of the Netflix shows that, it's just a very limited run of here's my 8 episodes and it's a full story from beginning to end. You could approach it that way. I don't know if that's how I would recommend it for politics, although it could be could be very great if you really want to dig into a specific issue that you're concerned about, and feature the story in a very specific way. So that's an option. Otherwise, you look at really kind of a long, kind of open-ended run to your podcasts. And I think there's some value in that if you want to have a continued conversation. I think it really plays well for politicians and advocacy groups and campaigns that have a very strong message, kind of a movement behind them, and really, can kind of communicate in a consistent way. I almost think of, going back to Ronald Reagan and kind of his fireside chats, that sort of thing. Like, this is kind of a similar concept to what you might be doing there, but in kind of a new way from a political tradition standpoint. So as I think about, creating your own show and your own podcast, there's some requirements that go with that from a production standpoint. So you need a recording setup, where are you going to be? How do you have the equipment you need? And you also are going to require some software and some manpower. And that includes coordinating and scheduling, production and editing of a show. So, there's time that goes into not just recording your show, but also packaging it up and distributing it to podcast networks, as well as making sure that it's being hosted somewhere that it's easily accessible, and then gets published to places like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, several others. And, circling back to the advertising side too, a lot of the terrestrial radio is now publishing content as podcasts as well. So iHeartRadio, for example, has a very large content portal that they produce and publish their own podcast to as well. So if you're looking for some examples of elected officials, politicians that have been successful in this podcasting arena, there's some that stick out. So Ted Cruz has The Verdict with Ted Cruz. That's, has a very large following. I know Congressman Devin Nunes has the Devin Nunes podcast. So that's something that I haven't checked out myself, but I know exists out there. Hold These Truths with Dan Crenshaw. That's one to look at. And, for former Speaker Newt Gingrich, he has a podcast out there called Newt's World. And I think he also has some additional podcasting content that is involved in his kind of media network as well. So, so it's definitely something that's working for some people, but my recommendation would be, if that's something you think you want to do, start out with our next option, which is really starting into kind of the guest appearance arena. So get your feet wet by doing it, by being on some other shows and talking to people. I know for most campaigns, most elected officials, you probably have some level of comfort and familiarity in front of a microphone and talking with authority on conversations. I know, having worked on the Hill, a lot of members of Congress record a weekly radio program that they distribute, which really is quite similar to what podcasting is. It's just kind of packaged and distributed in a slightly different manner. So that is something to be thinking about. But from guest appearance standpoint, this is something where the Prosper Group helps clients in this area. It's really relatively easy to participate in one of these podcasts by sitting down at your computer. Pretty much any podcast show is going to have a portal that you can sit down that's either is a Zoom conversation, very similar to being in a Zoom phone call, and you can sit down and have a conversation with the host and record the podcast guest appearance in that way. We work with podcast hosts to book these appearances. So that's definitely something that can happen out there. You want to we take into consideration your target audience. We look for friendly experiences And actually, most podcasts are going to be friendly experiences where you can talk about an area where you have expertise. If you're going on a show and you're surprised, then somebody hasn't done their homework. Quite frankly, someone who is booking you on a show, part of their onus and responsibility is having a sense of what is the environment I'm walking into. And so there really shouldn't be any surprises or any hostility from a host. That's something that if that were there, I would say probably want to steer clear of those sort of situations. Probably not a lot of value coming out of that. So, the other thing that I would say, one of the nice things about podcasts is as you're thinking about reaching an audience, there are podcasts for just about everything, whether it's agriculture, hunting, fishing, social issues, you name it. So maybe you're an elected official that's really into fishing or really into hunting, or really you want to talk about preserving our environment so that hunting and fishing can continue to occur. There's definitely some opportunities to communicate with people in a way that creates value and to have those conversations. So, we talked about kind of the three different approaches. They each have different commitment levels. I think, for anyone who's interested in doing a podcast show, again, I would recommend starting out with some guest appearances and getting a feel for that. There's some benefits to you, particularly in the guest appearances, but also if you had your own podcast. So there's some inherent content creation that goes into it. You can, share that information with your audience and your following, your volunteers, your supporters, and you can use that content to direct search traffic too. So, if you want to show kind of the involvement and some of the conversation, you could even pay for ads to help promote that you were on that show, and just, try and drive people to positive media interactions. One thing to know, most shows record in advance to allow for production time. So, it's not usually going to be the sort of thing where you record today and you're on the air, or you're on a podcast that's being pushed out tomorrow. So there's time to be budgeted there. But yeah, if you're interested in being on podcasts, particularly booking, but we can help with the advertising, we can help get you started. Whether you're interested in any of those, we can really help. So feel free to talk to us here at the Prosper Group, reach out to any of our strategists, and we're happy to help you out and have a conversation about those things. Well, that's it for today's show. As always, thank you for listening. We produce and publish the Prosper Group Week in Review every Friday. Subscribe, enjoy your weekend, and download again next week. Thanks. Have a great day.
You can find our Prosper Group Week in Review podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
If you like the show, please subscribe and share.